With barely 90 minutes remaining before U.S. President Donald Trump's self-declared deadline threatened to reduce, in his own words, a whole civilization to ash, a social media post from Islamabad changed the trajectory of the most dangerous military confrontation the Middle East had seen in a generation. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, leading a country simultaneously fighting its own war along the Afghan border, managing an economy barely stabilized after near default, and navigating its most complex geopolitical positioning in decades, appealed publicly and directly to both Washington and Tehran to step back from the edge and allow diplomacy to breathe. Within hours, President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire, explicitly crediting conversations with Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, Pakistan's military chief, as the decisive factor. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed the agreement and heaped praise on Islamabad. The world exhaled. Oil markets reversed, and a country once routinely dismissed as diplomatically unreliable had just brokered what may be the most consequential ceasefire of the 21st century to date. To understand how this happened and why it matters not just today, but for the decades ahead, you have to go far deeper than a single social media post. You have to trace a diplomatic tradition that stretches back more than 50 years. Pakistan's current role is rooted first in geography. Iran is not a distant crisis for Pakistan. It is a neighbor with whom Islamabad shares a long border, overlapping ethnic populations, security concerns, energy anxieties, and deep religious and social connections. A war that weakens or destabilizes Iran does not remain confined to Iranian territory. It threatens to spill directly into Pakistan through sectarian tensions, refugee flows, fuel shocks, and militancy in Balochistan. This is not abstraction. Pakistan has a direct and visceral stake in the stability of its Western neighbor, making its mediation not an act of geopolitical charity, but one of strategic self-preservation. Understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding why Pakistan's diplomacy carried the credibility it did in both Tehran and Washington. Pakistan's record in high-profile back-channel diplomacy includes one of the most significant geopolitical gambits of the 20th century. In 1971 and 1972, Pakistan's then-President General Yahya Khan facilitated the secret back-channel contacts that led to President Richard Nixon's historic 1972 visit to China. The diplomatic breakthrough that reshaped the Cold War and paved the way for formal U.S.-China relations in 1979. This was not a peripheral role. Henry Kissinger's secret flight to Beijing was routed through Islamabad. Pakistan provided the cover, the logistics, and the trusted communication channel that neither Washington nor Beijing could provide to each other directly. That episode remains the clearest historical proof that Pakistan has long been capable of serving as a channel between adversaries when the stakes are high enough, protecting secrecy, carrying messages, and managing a diplomatic maneuver whose consequences were far larger than Pakistan itself. The Geneva Accords of April 1988, which set a binding timetable for the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, represent another landmark chapter in Pakistan's mediatory record. Pakistan was not a detached bystander in those negotiations. It was a frontline state, a signatory, and an intermediary all at once, working closely with the United States while managing its relationships with the Afghan Mujahideen factions it had been supporting throughout the Soviet-Afghan War. That dual role, simultaneously a stakeholder and a mediator, defined Pakistan's diplomatic identity and would prove both its greatest asset and its greatest source of controversy in subsequent decades. More recently, Pakistan facilitated the contacts between the Afghan Taliban and Washington that led to the 2020 Doha Agreement, setting the stage for the withdrawal of U.S.-led NATO troops from Afghanistan. That agreement, however imperfect its aftermath, required someone capable of talking to the Taliban, an organization that only Pakistan, by virtue of its deep and historically entangled relationship with the group, could reliably access. The pattern is unmistakable. Pakistan opens doors that others cannot open themselves. Pakistan's attempts to mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran form another chapter in this history, though a more frustrating one. In January 2016, then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif flew to both capitals in a single trip after protesters ransacked Saudi diplomatic missions in Iran, only for Saudi Arabia to publicly deny any formal mediation had been agreed. In October 2019, Prime Minister Imran Khan undertook shuttle diplomacy between Tehran and Riyadh following drone and missile strikes on Saudi Aramco facilities that temporarily halved the kingdom's oil output, an effort that produced no breakthrough but maintained Pakistan's positioning as a willing intermediary. When China ultimately brokered the restoration of Saudi-Iranian diplomatic ties in Beijing in March 2023, Pakistani analysts were quick to note that the first direct contact between the two sides since 2016 had taken place on the sidelines of a summit hosted in Islamabad. As one Pakistani diplomat observed, the country's forte has long been opening channels and building confidence, bringing parties into proximity even when a final resolution remains out of reach. What made the 2026 Iran crisis different? What transformed Pakistan from a facilitator of preliminary contacts into the central architect of an actual ceasefire was a combination of structural opportunity and a remarkable personal transformation in Pakistan's international standing. Since Osama bin Laden was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs in Pakistan in 2011, Pakistan's ties with Washington and the West had plunged, compounded by the jailing of former Prime Minister Imran Khan and accusations that Islamabad was supporting the Taliban behind the scenes during the 20-year Afghan war. That period of estrangement created the context against which Pakistan's recent diplomatic rehabilitation becomes extraordinary. Two turning points catalyzed the reversal. First, in early 2025, Pakistan helped capture a key suspect linked to the 2021 Kabul airport bombing that killed 170 Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers, prompting public thanks from Trump and renewed intelligence sharing. Second, Pakistan's restrained public posture following a brief military confrontation with India, publicly acknowledging Trump's role in de-escalation, built genuine goodwill at the highest levels of the Trump administration. Pakistan also represents some Iranian diplomatic interests in Washington, where Tehran has no embassy, a structural position that gave Islamabad an irreplaceable function the moment direct U.S.-Iran communication collapsed under conditions of open warfare. For Iran, which no longer trusted its Arab neighbors because of their deep ties with the United States, Pakistan offered something qualitatively different. A country that shares a border with Iran, with overlapping populations and deep historical, cultural, and religious ties that Washington nonetheless takes seriously. The Gulf states, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, were simultaneously under Iranian drone and missile attack throughout the conflict, making them structurally incapable of serving as neutral intermediaries. As one analyst noted, the intra-GCC disagreements over ceasefire terms and the complicated relationships these states had with Iran created the need for exactly the kind of actor Pakistan represented, whose ties with both sides made it a natural choice. The mechanics of Pakistan's mediation unfolded in stages. On March 25th, Pakistani officials delivered a U.S.-led 15-point ceasefire proposal to Iran. Iran rejected the plan and outlined its own conditions. On March 31st, Pakistan and China jointly delivered a 5-point peace initiative calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. On April 5th, a new ceasefire framework was introduced after overnight negotiations between Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi. Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar traveled to Beijing to consult with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, a dialogue analysts say carried significant weight, with China's buy-in reinforcing the message Iran was receiving from multiple directions simultaneously. The ceasefire that finally landed on April 8th emerged from this layered, multi-actor process in which Pakistan served as both the primary channel and the public face of the diplomatic effort, providing both Trump and Khamenei's successor government with a face-saving framework that neither had to construct themselves. The ceasefire's announcement included a remarkable acknowledgement from both principals. Trump stated explicitly that he had agreed to the pause based on conversations with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir of Pakistan, adding that they had requested that I hold off the destructive force being sent tonight to Iran. Araghchi was even more profuse in his praise, crediting Pakistan's leadership for its tireless efforts to end the war. Analysts noted that this marked the first time Pakistan had simultaneously managed active conflict mediation between two adversaries under ongoing military escalation without direct contact between them, a qualitatively new threshold in Pakistan's diplomatic history. The strategic implications for the global order extend well beyond the immediate ceasefire. The mediation has demonstrated that the architecture of international crisis management is shifting away from the traditional Euro-Atlantic framework that dominated the post-Cold War era and toward a more multipolar arrangement in which middle powers with unique network positions carried decisive weight. Pakistan's role as host for the Islamabad talks beginning April 10th, with the U.S. Vice President leading the American delegation, places Islamabad at the center of negotiations over Iran's nuclear future, Hormuz transit rights, and the structure of Middle Eastern security, issues with direct implications for energy prices in Europe, maritime insurance for global shipping, and the coherence of Western sanctions architecture. For NATO and European planners, the shift is significant. The terms of Iran's post-war settlement are being shaped not in Brussels, Paris, or Geneva, but in Islamabad, with a country that does not recognize Israel, maintains a deep strategic partnership with China, and operates under the command of a military establishment with its own distinct foreign policy instincts. The big question is whether Pakistan can lock down a vital peace that both secures its interests and elevates its international profile. Headwinds are serious. Nobody is quite sure which of the competing ceasefire frameworks has actually been agreed upon. Iran's reclosure of the Strait of Hormuz in response to continued Israeli strikes on Lebanon has already threatened to unravel the agreement, and Pakistan's lack of diplomatic relations with Israel places real limits on its mediation reach. And yet, even accounting for those constraints, the strategic conclusion stands. A country that was not at the table for the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, not at the table for the Abraham Accords, not at the table for any of the major Middle Eastern diplomatic settlements of the previous decade, has now placed itself at the center of the region's most consequential negotiation. Pakistan's diplomatic tradition, from the Nixon-China back-channel to the Geneva Accords to Doha to Islamabad, reveals a country that has always understood its own peculiar value. It can talk to people who cannot talk to each other, and in moments when the alternative is catastrophe, that is precisely the capability the world needs most.